Welcome to Out of the Question, a podcast that looks behind some common questions and uncovers the question behind the question while providing real solutions for biblical world and life view. Your host is Andrea Schwartz, a teacher and mentor and founder of the Chalcedon Teacher Training Institute.
Thanks for joining me today for this episode of the Out of the Question podcast. When I was a child, family vacations involved going to historical sites. We lived in New York, so we would go to New England, we'd go to Pennsylvania, we'd go to DC, we'd go to Virginia. And although my brother and sisters and I would rather have spent time in the motel pool, my parents made sure that we went through the history that was available to us in museums, national parks, etc. And I came away from those experiences having an appreciation for American history that was then supported when I went to school. Well, my guest today is Bill Potter, and we'll be discussing the question, are national parks enforcing a singular worldview on park visitors? Now, just so you know that he's qualified to talk on this perspective, Bill Potter is an experienced historian who combines a lifelong study of American history with an uncommon ability to captivate audiences of all ages as he traces the providential acts of God throughout the ages. He has taught history in high schools and colleges. He's led many tours of American and European historical sites and brings to each event a wealth of experience and knowledge. As an experienced researcher and writer, he possesses a practical knowledge of antiquarian books, documents, and artifacts, and has published several short books and has penned many articles and book reviews for publication. He's earned a well-deserved reputation as a man gifted in communicating the story of God's providential hand in American history. He's the father of 8 and appreciates the necessity of passing on to succeeding generations the richness of both our regional and national history. He and his wife, Leslie, live in Virginia. So, Bill, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Andrea. It's a privilege.
So before we delve into the narrative being imposed by the National Park Service, please give my listeners a rundown of some of the circumstances which led you to originally write your essay for Faith for All of Life, our Chalcedon publication, describing your experience in leading tours in various national parks.
Okay. I'm the chief historian for a history tour company. The name of our company is Landmark Events, and it's landmarkevents.org if you'd like to see what we do and follow some of the links to our tours. But I teach from what professional historians typically call a providential interpretation of American history, similar to the way the Puritans viewed the world. And we teach from a thoroughly Christian worldview. And we go to the places where history happened. And so we visit a lot of national parks. We visit a lot of battlefields. We visit historic homes and monuments and all the places of, say, Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia and Boston, places such as that, and then Scotland and Ireland and England. We travel pretty far afield, and we try to view history from a biblical worldview perspective. And thus I have come in contact with all sorts of historical sites, in particular National Park Service sites. National Park Service owns 424 national parks.
Wow.
And they own 84 million acres. And so, although we go to a lot of battlefields and other historic sites like that, we also do a rafting trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, to a couple rafting trips. And so we get to see some of the natural sites in South Dakota. We go to the Custer National Park and places where there's lots of acreage and hiking territory and that sort of thing.
Do families normally constitute the bulk of the people who participate? Is this usually a family kind of thing or just individuals?
Yes, we're actually really oriented to family, especially homeschool families. I would say they probably make up 90 to 95% of our clientele. And we're set up to handle lap babies to great grandparents, and sometimes we get that whole spectrum in one family. And our tours typically are less than 50 people. 50 is usually typically our cutoff. Some of them are just 2-day tours. Some of them last 2 weeks. It just depends on what it is. But yes, we're geared to families. We do get lots of individuals too. And sets of grandparents and all sorts of people. But we're kind of geared to families and teaching children as well as adults.
I see. So tell my listeners a little bit about some of the experiences that you ran into that prompted the essay that you wrote for us in 2016.
Well, we had a few over the years, say over the last 20 years. We've had a few run-ins at various historical sites with interpreters that want to be able to tell the story because they really don't approve of so-called narratives that outsiders bring to their historical sites. And in 15, we ran into a buzzsaw at a national battlefield. We didn't realize it at the time, but we were on a tour that we do almost every year, and that's the New Orleans area. And we always go to the Chalmette battlefield, and that's where the Battle of New Orleans took place with General Andrew Jackson, who assembled an army to try and thwart the British attempt to capture New Orleans toward the end of the War of 1812. And the battlefield at Chalmette is lovely. It's well preserved. They've got, I think, most of the battlefield preserved there. They have a nice visitor center. And we've been going there for a number of years. In 2015, we had our normal tour there. And about a month later, as we were preparing to actually go do our annual tour in Scotland, we got a package in the mail from the National Park Service, which said that we have been indicted for illegal guiding.
Illegal guiding is what they said?
Yes.
Wow.
And we'd never heard of that. We didn't know what that was. It kind of sounded like a violation of our First Amendment rights, but we certainly got the opportunity to look into it. Upon further investigation, we found that they had heard some of the things that we said at the battlefield, and one of their historians had followed us around, apparently. And also, we do a number of different things at most battlefields. We used to do little reenactments with wooden guns and let the children pretend and we do different things. We have relay races and stuff like that. At that particular place, we actually didn't do that, but our president, Kevin Turley, had some of his grandchildren with him, and he carried a British flag, and they were chasing him around with wooden guns. And so we were accused of conducting a war reenactment on the battlefield, which they said was also illegal, and that we needed to appear in court to pay to admit our guilt and to pay a $300 fine. And so Kevin, in December of 2015, so it's the same year, a few months after we had been there, maybe 6 months later, was our court appearance. Mr. Turley showed up at the court to find out what all the hoo-ha was about. And the only ones at the court was the attorney for the National Park Service and the judge. And the judge asked if we had an attorney, and Kevin said no. We pled innocent of the charges, but we wanted to investigate exactly what the charges meant by illegal guiding, because there is no statutory law about teaching on a national historic site. And we've discovered that the National Park Service really doesn't have policies regarding interpretation. But what the policies they have are, you're not allowed to do metal detecting or relic hunting on a National Park Service property. You'll go to prison for a long time if you do that. You're not allowed to set up a business at the park. You're
like
not
a
allowed
lemonade stand. You're not allowed to have a lemonade stand at a national.
No, nothing. Yeah, nothing.
Okay.
Nothing that's going to bring you income.
Okay.
Because that's what they're there for. And they have their own guides, their own docents, their own Park Service historians, and they are the ones who are tasked with interpreting the site to the public. And so they don't like what they would consider competition from other historians or people outside their approved group.
Right. So let me just stop you for a second. I remember as I was reading the account that at one place, your group was told that they were going to separate the children from the parents, and the children were going to get their own tour. I know that wasn't received well by you or the parents, but what was their rationale for that?
I don't know what their rationale really is. That was at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. That has not happened since. That happened one time there, and it happened also at Montpelier, the home of President James Madison. We got off the bus and they said, all the children over here, all the parents over there, we're going to take your children and we're going to teach them what they need to know.
Wow.
And they did the same thing at Fort Sumter. And we said, no, we don't work that way. The parents all stay with the children stay with the parents, and we operate as families. And they said, no, we know what they need to know, and you don't.
Wow.
Well, we refused and dug in, and they let us go our way and do our thing. But at Montpelier, they divided us up into groups, and Montpelier, I believe, is either run by a private association or is a state site. I don't believe it's National Park Service. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Now, but anyway, they divided the families up so they could take smaller groups, but they did not divide the families themselves, separate them from their children. But their attitude was, we're the experts, and we know what children need to know, and you don't. And we don't want you there while we do it. And that particular episode was probably 15 years ago.
I see. So I have a question. Let's say, and I'm sure it's happened, when you submit to, okay, we'll go with your docent, and the docent says something that's inaccurate from a historical point of view, and you wanted to add in a biblical perspective, would you be silenced? Would you be told you're not allowed to talk? We're the ones who talk?
Normally, the docents will allow you to ask questions.
Okay.
But normally also they will not turn the floor over to you as an expert or to add something that they didn't know. I say that's not 100% of the case, but just about. And so we're not allowed to guide in certain places. But like battlefields, we've always been allowed to guide. And most historic homes, even museums, we're normally allowed to guide in museums too. But some of them absolutely not. And we found out that each national park superintendent is somewhat of a law unto himself. They can make up whatever rules they want for their park. And that's what happened in New Orleans, from our perspective, is that the administrator of the park decided that we were not telling the story the way it needed to be told, and that we were some rogue group that was not going to conform to their narrative. And one of the interesting things about that, Andrea, if you want to fast forward to the end, they ended up dropping 364 days later. They dropped the lawsuit because we ended up with one of the top flight law firms in New Orleans, who was I think it's a Christian law firm, and they took us on pro bono and went after the National Park Service. And the end was that they were going to be publicly embarrassed. The Park Service was. They were going to not just lose, but they were going to be objects of ridicule in the end. And so they ended up dropping the case. And during that year, we received a call from another national park, from a lawyer of one of the national parks that we frequent. And he said, the entire National Park Service is watching your case.
Wow.
You're the first ones that have been chosen to be, held up as an example of people who are trying to communicate things outside of the approval of the government. And they chose you to be the kind of the opening round of that, or the guinea pigs for that. He said, and the whole Park Service is watching to see what happens.
So let me ask you a question. Most people, would say, wow, being a park ranger, what a great job. And they're probably really nice people. And maybe people have encountered very friendly people. Is it a new thing that there is a narrative that is approved? I mean, we're used to it in education. We're used to it in media. Is this a relatively new thing, or has it been growing all along?
I think it's been kind of growing over the years. It seems to me, just from my experience, that it suddenly was accelerated during the Obama administration. He chose a new head of the National Park Service, one that was going to, as they said, search out and find 500 LGBTQ sites to add to the National Park Service historic sites, and change the narrative that's been going on. And I saw it starting to happen in Civil War battlefields. I know that they got the word at Civil War battlefields that from now on, you need to talk about slavery, and you need to downplay the Confederates and the South, etc. And I saw that, coming over the years, a little bit here, a little bit there. And then I think it accelerated tremendously during the Obama administration, a whole new narrative. Well, what I was going to say, in terms of, in answer to your question, the New Orleans case is a good example of that. Now, the docents have always been given their script. And there hasn't been, much dissent regarding what the script is. How different could their interpretation be really from ours when it came to studying the Battle of New Orleans? For me, I talk about Andrew Jackson and how in God's providence, this particular battle happened the way it did, and an overwhelming American victory, almost miraculous. Historians down through the ages have all said that this whole battle was somewhat of a miracle, given the ability of the British troops and the experience of their commanders and all that stuff, and the amateur nature of the Americans and all of that. And you put it all together, and Americans shouldn't have won, and they did. And it vaulted eventually. It made Andrew Jackson a national figure. Mm-hmm. It made him a national hero. In fact, from that point on, a lot of people just called him the hero, and everybody knew what they were talking about, Andrew Jackson. And so I mentioned that in the providence of God, this battle launched the career of Andrew Jackson, and he eventually became president of the United States. So things like that. Just he who notes providences will have providences to note, and that's one of them from that battle. And then I talk about the tactical aspects of the battle, who was where and what kind of weapons they carried, and it's kind of the ebb and flow of the combat. I'm a military historian, and that sort of thing. So our president, Kevin Turley, slipped in with another group that came to visit the battlefield. The battlefield is right on a levee, and a big paddle wheel steamer pulled up to the levee, and tourists came piling out of the boat. And the NPS sent one of their docents, almost all of whom are female, just as an aside. And one of them rushed up to the tourist boat and took the tourists down to the battlefield. And Kevin slipped in with the tourists to hear what the interpretation of that battle is all about, how different it is from what we say. And the docent began, or the guide, uniformed guide and historian presumably, she began by apologizing to the group on behalf of the National Park Service that many years ago there were slave cabins near that battlefield, and the National Park Service tore them down. And she wanted to apologize on behalf of the National Park Service for destroying such valuable historic property that's so important to the interpretation of the battlefield today. And then she went on to say that this battle was important because there were women in the ranks, and this was the first time that women were allowed to take up arms and defend the nation in a battle. Well, just about every single thing that she said about that wasn't true, but it went on to become a sort of a pseudo-feminist rant about women being liberated and the battle having importance to women's history and that kind of stuff. And sure enough, it's very different from what we teach when we go to that battlefield.
And it was a battlefield, so I guess it would make sense to talk about the battle. What did she frame as the reason for the battle?
Well, and she eventually mentioned a few of the reasons that the two armies had come together there, that it was the War of 1812 and that Britain wanted to capture New Orleans for strategic reasons, and that Andrew Jackson was handy, and so he was sent there to defend the city. But the emphasis was really on the diversity of the American army. There were pirates in the ranks. In fact, they contributed a great deal to the victory. Jean Lafitte and his crew were part of the battle. There were free blacks. There were slaves. There were French people. The diversity was what it was all about, and that's the American way. And that was sort of the importance of the battle for her.
I see. So a lot of people who want to make their vacations, historical tours, etc., if they're blank slates, or so to speak, they've just know nothing about this battle or any other battle, then this is what they think it was about. So this, from your perspective, is a reinterpretation of American history, kind of woke version.
Oh, sure. And that was, that was 6 years ago now. Our case was settled in 2016. We haven't had any problems since then, or any questioning what we do, or any resistance or pushback. And part of that, I think, is the fact that in the interim between our being charged and the case being dropped, Donald Trump was elected president, and they got a new director of the national park in that period.
I see.
And so I think that things probably, to some extent, were put on hold for 4 years. In other aspects, not so much. They've during the Obama administration, they had selected a number of college professors to track down all the LGBTQ sites, historic sites that would be important. Find out what important people in American history were sodomites, and let's elevate them and the places where they lived, and their significance can be recognized by the National Park Service, and the big yellow buses can pull up and learn about the freedom and diversity of America. And they have, I think that just continued within the bureaucracy of the national park.
I see.
Because now there are just plenty of LGBTQ sites that are recognized across the country and are promoted by the National Park Service. They have brochures on a whole host of things. And most, well, I don't know how many, whether it's many or most, but some of the ones that I've investigated are totally spurious, and there is no evidence or no proof of their interpretation of the individuals, especially.
I see. So what do you think about the fact that so many statues were vandalized and destroyed? And it was like people like, Christopher Columbus and Robert E. Lee. And do you think that was, and the reason that so little was done about it is part of this whole emphasis to rewrite American history and get rid of evidences that at one point people liked Christopher Columbus?
I think certainly, Andrea, that's the practical application of the philosophy and the theology really behind Black Lives Matter and some of the other radical reinterpreters of American history. It's really nothing new in history. The Romans had a policy called damnatio memoriae, to damn the memory of heroes of the past that have fallen out of favor with the current regime, and they need to be erased from history. And we see it, we see it writ large in George Orwell's 1984. He's working for the Ministry of Truth, and their purpose is to rewrite the past and completely obliterate those who have become non-persons, declared so by the government. And I think we see something similar happening today in our own country. It begins with rewriting the textbooks and downplaying certain individuals and bringing others to the fore. I know in some modern history textbooks, on the chapter, for instance, on the war between the states, Robert E. Lee is barely mentioned. Abraham Lincoln has pages and pages, and the only thing that they talk about is slavery. So the textbooks have been rewritten from a totally different perspective, and there's the gradual elimination. I mean, even George Washington only got a paragraph in one of the high school textbooks I saw on American history.
Wow.
Martin Luther King got an entire chapter. So really history begins in like 1954 now. And everything prior to that is racist and irrelevant and demonstrates nothing but white supremacy. So those are all fair game for the writers of history, and it's subsidized by big business and promoted by federal government, local and state too, in many places. So yes, there's an attempt to, and I'm pretty sure Rushdoony would have said it's part of the war against God,
right?
The war against history that's been going on since the beginning, and has broken out in the open in our own country with the attempted destruction of Western civilization and even the idea of it.
Mm-hmm. So As a historian, I'm sure you have knowledge and probably a opinion on this. Teddy Roosevelt was the big proponent of national parks, correct?
Yes. He was really the beginning of it.
Yeah. Do you think his thrust on this was a statist thrust, or was it more that he was an outdoorsman and he thought this would be good for people? Because for the federal government to own such a vast amount of land and then can tell you what you can and cannot say on this land seems to be contrary to what our framers would have thought appropriate. So do you have any comments on Teddy Roosevelt in this regard?
Well, I'm a great admirer of Theodore Roosevelt, but there are aspects to his political theory and the way he worked it out that, in fact, I might not even have voted for him at that time. But there are aspects of his expansion of the power of the presidency that I think went outside the constitutional boundaries established by the founders. I know that he's in huge disfavor with libertarians, and he's accused of, being a bully and a progressive, and indeed he was a progressive in the early stages of that particular movement. And part of that really was I think the second thing that you said about it was more consistent with how he thought, that he was an outdoorsman and he wanted everybody to share in his love of the creation, and he wanted the federal government to preserve the things that he loved for other Americans to appreciate and enjoy too.
Yeah.
I don't think it was self-consciously saying the government has to control all of this land, or it'll be destroyed. Although there is some of that, but not to the extent that it would be today.
I see. So, I mean, sometimes people will frame the argument that we're going to preserve nature, and then those people who don't like what the current regime or the current bureaucracy really is promoting hate the environment. But that couldn't be further from the truth. It doesn't have to be the either or that's often framed, correct?
Right. I agree. It doesn't have to be the either or. And Theodore Roosevelt certainly, he understood that. And he understood similar things in politics too. Although, he's somewhat enigmatic. When he was out west and was traveling to these wonderful places and appreciating them and doing his naturalist studies, in his saddlebags, he had 2 books that he carried with him when he rode out. In one saddlebag, he had the Bible, which he loved and appreciated and read, and talked about the creation. And in the other saddlebag, he had On the Origin of the Species.
Oh, my.
By Charles Darwin, which it was underlined and annotated, and he read it like he did the Bible. So he's somewhat, he can be pretty enigmatic.
Or schizophrenic when you look at it.
Or schizophrenic because he believes both creation and evolutionary theory as Darwin expressed it. So in some ways he was a man of his day, intellectually and educationally, as he, it was science, the god of humanism.
Yeah.
And he was a scientist, and he, appreciated the world in that way. And his whole life he'd been a naturalist. And if he hadn't been president, he said he wanted, he would like to have been a naturalist. But at the same time, he read the scriptures and appreciated creation and the fact that God created the universe and all of that. So
I see.
Schizophrenic, enigmatic. He probably represents a lot of Americans in that day.
Yes. And unfortunately, the legacy of that thought going down through, the 20th century and now into the 21st century. So let me ask you this. It would be easy to be discouraged because our public school system still promotes lies. even when we have a change of person in the State House or in the White House, we still have this entrenched bureaucracy. Is it your opinion that the only way we are going to be able to prevail in this is to know our history and not rely on the sanitized or the changed? In other words, that we continue to promote a providential view of history, and organizations like yours, and you're not the only organization that does this, right? That people really need to support, whether it's the court case that you were up against, or even when you're making a decision what you're going to do with your dollars for vacation, to support groups and organizations like you.
Yeah. One of our slogans is, if you want a vacation with purpose, look and see what we do and where we go and the grand time that we have. And so really Christians starting with their children, educating their children properly, so that the next generation will be willing to take a stand where they have to take a stand, even though it's going to be costly. So starting with our own children and grandchildren. Now, for me, I have 23 grandchildren so far.
Oh, wow.
And, we want them to be in the same place that we are in terms of understanding of truth, the application of Scripture to all of life, the importance of God's law, and all of those things. And for Christian families, that's really where it starts and needs to be promoted. But in the larger sense, where we have opportunity to do more than that, those of us who have been put in positions to do that need to do that. I get invited to speak to civic groups from time to time, and at universities, and I don't back off on any of my presuppositions. And I always start with the historicity of Genesis and the importance of understanding who God is and who man is, and sin and redemption and all of those things that we know are absolutely true. Most people think that history is a result of or a product of chance evolution. And I'd say 99% of the professional historians believe that. I saw it in the academic world, and it works itself out at places like the National Park Service. There is no national park like the ones out west in particular that are not interpreted based on an evolutionary presuppositional teaching basis. I mean, 100%. And we need to understand that, and we need to tell people differently.
You bring up the Garden of Eden, Satan was a approved tour guide who was going to tell them, no, you surely won't die. So the original
he definitely rewrote the narrative.
Absolutely. So are there Bill Potters being grown? Do you see young people who will become natural heirs to what you do and continue to advocate what you advocate? Because you obviously have lots of people who will come participate in your tours. Are you hopeful that your efforts will continue when the Lord decides to take you home?
Oh, that's one of our greatest hopes, and we're always on the lookout. We bring young men in from time to time to help us at different places that have enough training or expertise in a particular area. So we've been trying to encourage guys that have that kind of interest, and it is one of the problems that needs to be solved, and that is reproducing ourselves in terms of our theology and our faith. And there are plenty of young people who are interested in history and are voracious readers and are autodidacts when it comes to learning American history, especially, but other areas of history too. And they need to be brought along, so that we will have the replacements when the casualties occur. And that's one of our main concerns. And we're always on the lookout for those kinds of young people. My own experience, I have a lot of academic training, and when I was an undergraduate in college, I was taught 4 years Van Tillian presuppositional apologetics and read Rushdoony every week for about 3 years as a college student. And I went right out into a public school and started repeating all of that and applying it. Didn't make me the most popular guy in the teacher's room. But since then, it's been almost exclusively, well, other than, my academic education, my teaching has been mostly Christian schools, Christian families, etc. And it's because of my educational experience that I can do what I do. And a lot of Christian young people are not going to get the kind of training that I got from non-Christians in the university setting. But I was so well grounded that I was able to do that on the graduate level.
Right. So that brings up a point that I'd like you to comment on. We still have this fallacy prevailing that you have to go to college. And I believe that there is a lot of information and a lot of experience that needs to be shared in a much more mature fashion than you might see in the typical grammar high school. However, if you're not grounded, when you describe what that 3 years was like for you, that meant that when you went to university, you could say, no, that's not biblical. No, that's almost right, but almost isn't good enough here because, that kind of stuff. Do you think that organizations like yours or companion organizations that we should be looking at creating, subsidizing, and having Christian parents have their children intern and make a dedicated effort that we're going to be the historians of the future? Much like Dr. Rushdoony was able to be an expert witness in court cases because he had such a wealth of knowledge. The way we're going to do it isn't by sending them to traditional secular or even pablum-like Christian colleges, correct?
Right. No, I agree. That's it's silly that people think that every high school student needs to go to college. 95% of them need to stay home and work and learn in other ways. Just as a side note, I know that Liberty University here in Virginia, in Lynchburg, has new graduate programs in history. And one of the things that they're training young people for is being guides, national parks, and being docents at historic sites. That's part of the program for young people who are interested in history. And of course, that's a school that got in early on the distance learning, and you can get all your degrees without ever setting foot on campus online. So there are a lot of tools that Christian young people have at their fingertips to learn and add to their education as well as experience. And I think that's the best route to go today. I don't recommend college just about anybody.
Right. And our Chalcedon's good friend Roger Schultz has a lot to do with the history.
I was going to mention Roger. He's the guy.
Yep, absolutely.
It's his program. Yep.
Very good. All right.
Wonderful.
Bill, thanks for sharing your experiences, your perspective, and your hope, because you're not discouraged. You're someone who's hopeful.
Not at all. Not at all. We know that we win in the end. The victory is already there, and we just have to be faithful. God calls us to be faithful in our own time and place, and the results are His, and we know what the end result is. So there's no reason to be pessimistic about it.
Very good. I imagine there are going to be people who hear this that say, I'd like to go on one of these tours, or I'd like to know about this guy more. Give your contact information and the website address again, so that now people can get out their pencils or their tablets or whatever they'll record this on and give the information.
It's our website is www.landmarkevents.org, and everything is there. All the information on our tours, their cost, their length. I publish an article every week called Historical Highlights, and we have a number of resources available, but it's all off that website. And you can see the tours that we do, how they work, what they cost, and how you can become a part of it.
So if people are interested, not so much or in the tours, but also conversing with you, getting you as a speaker, doing homeschool seminars, whatever.
Yes.
Is that through that website as well, or is there a direct way to contact you?
There's a direct way to contact me. Anyone can contact me anytime if they have questions. I get lots of questions about books because I read so much and have a significant library. And my email address is billpotter.historian@gmail.com. And people can contact me anytime because I speak at father and son retreats and homeschool conventions. I was out west last year for a big homeschool convention up in Oregon. Other venues too. For a Reformation weekend, I speak to a number of Christian families in Michigan every year. They have me come back, talk about the Reformation, Second Reformation in Scotland, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. I'm available for all kinds of groups and events.
So for parents who are listening or grandparents, if you're growing one of these future Bill Potters, he'll have a different name, but he will have she will have the thrust to go ahead and present an accurate history in terms of the Bible, because if it's not biblical, then it's not an accurate history. I would encourage you to go to one of these tour events, or at least read all you can that's on that website, so you get a sense of a projected educational future for your children, because we've got to stop giving our brightest and our best to the enemy to tell them that a particular battle was all about women. All right, Bill. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Andrea. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be on your show.
All right. Listeners, Out of the Question podcast at gmail.com is how you get a hold of us, and we look forward to talking with you next time.
Thanks for listening to Out of the Question. For more information on this and other topics, please visit chalcedon.edu.